Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our third event in the Seminoles Decide series. We're really happy to have you here today. I'm personally very excited. All of you that came out, I think you did yourself a personal favor because you're going to learn a lot today about the economy. Let me just give you a bigger picture about what Seminoles Decide is. We have 2 more events left. I'm very excited for them, and you should be too. Hope you'll come out to them. Our next event is next week in this venue. It's at 7 p.m., not 4 p.m. as we have had for the last 3 events. It's from 7 to 8:30. It's on education policy. Our moderator will be Dean Marcy Driscoll from the Education School. And then on November 1st, we're having our biggest event. It's called the Summit. We have a strong partnership with student government to make this a possibility. We're really excited about it. And that's going to be, again, November 1st, Turnbull Conference Center from 5 to 7:30. Just a few administrative things. If you are here for a class and you need to prove that you were here for credit, please come up to me afterwards and we will take care of that. Also, if you guys come up with questions throughout the next hour or so of discussion, just write them down because we will have a robust question and answer period at the end of the event today. So it's now my pleasure to introduce my friend Nick Russell. He's going to be the moderator for today. Nick is amongst one of the most successful individuals that I've had the pleasure of meeting here at Florida State. He recently graduated with a degree in economics and a degree in international affairs. That's 2 degrees, folks.
And he actually got a job.
Yeah, he has a job.
There you go.
He's interned for a U.S. Senator. He was a gubernatorial fellow, and he also interned for Parliament. And next fall, he'll be going to the London School of Economics. I'm very proud of him, and I'm very proud to introduce him today. Please welcome Nick Russell.
All right, so that was much more credit than I deserve. The real experts we have assembled here for you today. But before we get started and introduce them, I just wanted to thank the Division of Student Affairs, the Center for Leadership and Social Change, and of course Student Government Association for putting on this forum. I think it's a great event, and hopefully, like Josh said, our goal is that you're going to learn something here. We'll see at the end. You let me know if we didn't. That's the goal, though. But I think we will. We've got some great people here to talk about the presidential candidates' economic policies. And I'm just going to briefly introduce them and then let them talk to you a little bit about their background and interest in economics. Right here to my immediate left, we have Bob Sanchez. He is the policy director at the James Madison Institute. We also have Dr. Gwartney, who is a professor of economics and director at the Stavros Center, and Dr. Polivka, who is the director of the Claude Pepper Institute on the furthest left from me. And starting right here, Bob, if you wouldn't mind just telling us a little bit more about your background and what your interest in economics and being here today is.
I'm a recovering journalist, used to work for the Miami Herald, saw the coming demise of the newspaper business model, and came back to Tallahassee. And the James Madison Institute is a free market-oriented think tank advocating individual liberty, personal responsibility, limited government, and federalism.
Dr. Gwartney?
Yes, James Gwartney, director of the Stavros Center, professor of economics. The Stavros Center is heavily involved in economic education, that we specialize in training people about communications of economic ideas. So I guess in a sense this will be a test for me today in terms of my ability to communicate economic ideas. But I'd like to thank the sponsors of this program for inviting me, and I look forward to the participation.
Yes, thanks for the invitation to talk with you and to be on the panel with these fine gentlemen. The Pepper Center that I direct is mainly focused in 2 areas. One, retirement security, both in the private sector and the public programs, which are primarily, of course, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And one of the reasons we're interested in that now and has a top priority is that retirement security is rapidly becoming a crisis for growing numbers of people either close to retirement or who are already retired. And we can talk about why possibly as part of this discussion. And the other area is health care and long-term care, which of course is a great salience to older people. And we're especially interested in Medicare when it comes to acute care, and we're very much interested in Medicaid which is a state and federally funded program that funds most of what goes into paying for long-term care in this country. So those are our policy priorities, and we do a lot of policy analysis and some evaluation research around them.
Fantastic, and thank you all again for being here today. So to get things started off, I'm thinking, why are we all here? And it's probably because you have an interest in the economic policies of the presidential candidates, and in fact, that's what this forum is all about. But that is actually the case for pretty much most Americans who are going to be voting this election. The economy has been consistently rated throughout the campaign as the top issue that Americans are concerned about. So I think this is going to be a particularly exciting venue, because for this election, which is going to be historic for a few reasons in its own right, given the economic challenges our country is facing and the heightened attention on these policies, I'm very excited to see what this dialogue will produce today. And it's great to see you all here expressing that interest. Unfortunately, though, as important as those economic policies may be, I think we have a hard time making informed decisions about candidates' policies given the nature of today's political discourse. So to kind of just kick things off and get an idea of what I'm talking about here, we've got a couple campaign videos that are going to illustrate this idea. The first one we have, and we're going to do one from the left and one from the right, are both pretty amusing, but they don't really present any substantive ideas. This first video was released by the Obama campaign in the wake of the now infamous Big Bird comment made by Governor Romney. So let's take a look at that.
I'm Barack Obama, and I approve this message.
Bernie Madoff, Ken Lay, Dennis Kozlowski, criminals, gluttons of greed, and the evil genius who towered over them. One man has the guts to speak his name.
Big Bird. Big Bird. Big Bird.
It's me, Big Bird.
Big, yellow, a menace to our economy. Mitt Romney knows it's not Wall Street you have to worry about, it's Sesame Street.
I'm going to stop the subsidy to PBS.
Mitt Romney, taking on our enemies no matter where they nest.
A funny kind of jab at a comment that Governor Romney made. In terms of informing us about economic policies, though, not so great. Didn't learn a whole lot there. We've got another one from the right. This ad, you're going to have to prepare yourselves, has been universally recognized as one of the oddest campaign videos of all time. And of course, it came from Florida. It was from a candidate, Republican candidate, going for the U.S. House, and it was in a primary. I don't think he was successful in getting out of the primary, and I'll let you decide whether that's a good or bad thing. But brace yourselves. Let's take a look at this video.
I just love this ship. I got corporate subsidies just last week.
I got free health care for life.
My bank was bailed out by this ship.
This ship stimulated my husband's solar company.
How did this boat pay for all this stuff?
No questions on this ship.
Earn, earn, earn! Don't you care about the banks? Don't you care about the 99%? Earn, earn, earn!
Let's not enslave our children with debts. It's time to turn this ship around. I'm Mark Oxner, and I'm running for Congress. Go to my website and get involved. I'm Mark Oxner, and I approve this message.
So, again, gives us a little window into the thinking of the candidate. Obviously, is not a big fan of the president or government spending, but in terms of making an informed decision, again, not so useful. And I think that kind of rhetoric is perhaps a little too pervasive today. So, we're assembled here with the hope that when you leave today, hopefully you're going to get a better understanding of these economic policies and what you can glean from just watching the television and these ads every day. So, now, enough of me talking. I'd like to start with the panelists and lay some groundwork for the discussion. Today is about economic policies, but I think we first need to get a good grasp of what does that even mean? What is the kind of landscape that we're dealing with when we're talking about economic policies? So I'm wondering if the panelists, could you all maybe break down this concept and give us some concrete examples about the specific issues and policies that fall under this kind of general umbrella of economic policies for the audience?
Why don't you go ahead?
We want to go in order or in some kind of order? Well, I guess one broad distinction would be to talk about fiscal policy. And fiscal policy has to do with spending and budgetary matters and taxes, and is generally instituted, of course, by Congress with the approval of the President. So essentially that would be a policy that relates to what the spending composition is going to be. And the second rather broad type of policy that is less influenced, at least directly, by political considerations would be monetary policy. Of course, monetary policy would be determined by the Fed. We also might think of regulatory policy, of what kinds of regulations are imposed, and regulations in generally would, of course, be imposed by law with some interpretation through regulatory agencies. But those might be sort of three broad categories of policies which are likely to come up today.
Certainly. Any other thoughts on what we might be talking about here with economic policy?
Well, there's some subsidiary policies such as trade policies and that also have an impact on the economy.
And within the framework that Dr. Bortney laid out, you've got the issue of employment policy, and also a major feature of fiscal policy is the debt, the deficit, and the annual deficit and the total debt to the federal government. And much of what we're dealing with in terms of the policy debate that's occurring with this campaign, has for many years already, is the relationship between employment, what you do to increase employment or reduce unemployment, and how do you manage that in the context of also trying to contain the debt.
And also with respect to the debt, the national debt, which is $16 trillion and counting, I think some of those figures boggle the mind, the amount of the annual deficit, the amount of the cumulative national debt. When you put it another way, if you talk about how much it costs in interest to keep up the national debt and how the amount of the federal budget devoted to interest payments on the accumulated debt now dwarfs that spent on a lot of other constructive things such as infrastructure, and may even dwarf the amount spent on national security at some point, then it becomes, it puts it in a different context. It's as though you're spending a great deal of your family budget on interest on your credit cards or your student loans.
And maybe just to circle back a little bit, we talked about, I think, some broad categories: fiscal policy, government expenditures, monetary policy, which I want to come back to and deconstruct a little bit. But on this topic of the debt and the deficit, could you maybe just elaborate on what are those two concepts? We hear the word debt and deficit a lot. Are they the same thing? Are they different? And how do they come to be?
Shall I?
Go ahead.
Well, they're a little different, obviously. What we usually refer to as a deficit is more of an annual thing. How much more did you spend than you took in? And then when you add the deficits year after year, they begin to pile up. And they always have to be measured in terms of ability to pay. If you had a family with a very low income below the poverty level, may not be able to afford the mortgage on a $500,000 home, whereas a very wealthy family could. So by analogy, the size of the deficit is often, and the debt, national debt, are often referenced in terms of America's overall economy, or the gross domestic product, for example.
Yeah, just a little bit elaborating on the debt issue, because I think it's central to what we're likely to talk about today, and some alternative views with regard to the impact of budget deficits and in turn debt on the growth rate of the economy and the future prosperity as well as current prosperity of the economy. The debt today is roughly, Bob mentioned the 16 trillion figure. That is actually a little more than the size of our GDP now. And again, to put that in perspective, we could look at that compared to what it was in the aftermath of World War II, which is the time when we had the highest level of debt relative to our size of our economy in any previous time period. And at that time, it was roughly 100% of GDP, 1946, right after World War II. So we're at the same level that we were right after incurring huge, enormous expenditures for a war effort that covered 5-6 years. But one thing is different today about the size of the debt relative to right after World War II. You don't have to be a genius to sort of figure out when World War II was over, what was going to happen to military expenditures? They were going to decline. There was going to be sharp reductions in military expenditures and sharp reductions in total government expenditures, which would allow us to cut the size of the deficit and indeed shift the budget even to a surplus in a relatively near future. And that debt fell gradually in the aftermath of World War II. Now what's our situation? The situation today of the major expenditures of government relate to senior citizen programs. Programs on people like me. I mean, don't you feel good that you're contributing to try to help people, poor people like Dr. Bortney, or at least people, deserving people, not so much the poor, maybe. But in any case, expenditures on those programs, as I'm sure that Larry will elaborate because his institute is very familiar with that, they're going to increase in the years ahead. Why? Because we have more senior citizens. The baby boomers will be moving into the retirement years of their life, and those expenditures are going to rise. So this is confronting us with a real problem. We have the highest debt relative to the size of our economy in the history of our country, and we have the expectation, given government commitments to senior citizens, that expenditures are going to rise in the near future.
And could I interject one other difference? After World War II, there was a tremendous pent-up demand for goods and services, and so the economy boomed and was able to increase in size in relation to the debt. With a huge number of people retiring, if you've ever looked at the ads on TV, they're not interested in selling stuff to people beyond the age of 34, I think. Most of the ads are pitched to young because old people have everything they want already except maybe Maalox and Depends or something, so they are not viewed as consumers. So this wave of baby boomers retiring, I understand it's 10,000 a day now, is less likely to have the kind of pent-up demand for services other than health care that was evident with young families after World War II.
One of the things that needs to be kept in mind, and maybe we're moving in the direction of addressing it, is that Dr. Bortney mentioned that after World War II, when the debt was over 100%, and that we're approaching now with our debt level, total debt level, you were looking at a major reduction in defense budget. But what you also had was continuing investments by the federal government and state governments too, in K-12, or at least first grade through 12th grade education in most states across the country. But you also had the Veterans Bill, and you had a number of other major initiatives coming right out of World War II as the government shifted from a war industry-dominated economy to a more civilian-oriented domestic economy. And they continued to spend, and even with that high debt, spending increased after World War II, at least in the domestic economy, right on into the indefinite future for decades. And at the same time, the debt began to gradually decline. As growth picked up, what you had was increased capacity on the part of the American public to pay taxes, to pay revenues into the government treasury, which was used to contain and then gradually reduce the debt after the early to mid-50s. And at the same time, the defense budget even rose again with the Cold War that began really in terms of the impact on the defense budget about 1950. So you had a steady expansion of the public sector after World War II, even as you had a steady decline in the debt as a percentage of the gross national product right until the early 80s, for a period of about 35 years. And then, of course, the deficits and the debts began to increase after 81, 82, in part because of major increases in major decreases in taxes, a 40% reduction overall in the income tax that was a major priority of President Reagan. While you also had a big bump up in defense spending. That was another major priority of the Reagan administration. The deficit, the debt rose, the debt tripled from 1981 to 1986, from 1 trillion to about 2.9 trillion. It came down, it continued to grow slowly under President Bush, and then it came down very substantially in terms of reduced deficits under Clinton through the 90s. so that by 2000, we were actually looking at annual surpluses in the federal budget of $200 to $300 million. The projection was that we would have $5 trillion in surpluses by 2007. Of course, that did not happen. And it happened for 2 or 3 major reasons, including another round of major tax cuts under President Bush in 01 and 03, a huge buildup in the defense budget. We are actually spending substantially more today, if you count in Homeland Security, at over $1 trillion Homeland Security defense budget than we were at the height of the Cold War. So the combination, also the unfunded wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, those were funded off the books. The tax cuts, the unfunded wars, the big buildup in the defense budget, and the unfunded funding, the unaccounted for funding of the Part D prescription drug program and the Medicare program that was a major initiative that I supported and still support by President Bush. And that left a major deficit when we were looking at surplus at the beginning of the aughts. By 2008, 2009, we had over $5 trillion in debt, accumulated debt, that then passed on to the Obama administration.
Yeah, there is an alternative interpretation of that period of history. However, one interpretation is that the tax cuts under Reagan triggered one of the longest economic expansions in American history, which led to the surpluses in the 90s. And that by the time when President Bush took office, a recession had already begun in the wake of the dot-com bubble and its collapse. Sometimes you're not aware you have a malaise until you're a few weeks or a few months into it anyway, and that the tax cuts were a way to stimulate the economy without spending trillions of dollars on dubious projects.
Now, I'd just like to jump in here a little bit because I think we want to lay the groundwork, but we do want to get to the candidates of today. So, very interesting discussion. Perhaps we could talk about Reagan, but we do want to get to President Obama and Governor Romney. But
let me just say, before, that historical context is extremely important. And Bob is right about alternative perspectives, but it's very important because it has major implications for assessing current policy options.
Certainly. So, and I think so we've got a good background here. They've been talking about the national debt, government spending, deficits, fiscal policy. Got a little crash course from about World War II to today. So some of those trends in there, it's a lot to take in, but hopefully that will help clarify some of those issues and set the stage for when we get to the candidates. So that was a little bit of history kind of on government and what it has been doing. I think it would be good for us just to get some of your thoughts on the performance of the economy lately too. So we've talked about the policies that the government can enact to have an impact on the economy. If we're going to evaluate the candidates' policies, I think we need to be have a good understanding of what those trends are as it relates to the economic indicators. So, and maybe Dr. Gortney, if you want to kick us off, what are some of those key indicators we look at when we're talking about the economy? How do we know if it's getting better or worse? And what has been going on? Is the economy improving? Is it getting worse? Or are we somewhere in between?
Yeah, you want me to cover that in 30 seconds?
Hey, listen, we covered 30 years of history in 2 minutes.
Well, first of all, dealing with the first part of indicators of where we are. Of course, the one major indicator of how the economy is performing would be the real growth rate of GDP. GDP is the gross domestic product, the broadest measure of the output of goods and services that is in fact being produced. Historically, that growth rate in the United States has been about 3.3%. And by historically, I'm talking about over a long period of time, 50 years, 100 years, roughly at that 3% kind of range. The growth rate in terms of GDP, well, let me, before I'll come back and say a little bit more about the growth rate, but another indicator of how the economy is performing would be the employment statistics. The unemployment rate is the most widely cited figure. Most of you are probably aware that dropped to 7.8%. First time it had been below 8% in what, 43, 44 months, something along that particular line. And that is very high relative to historical standards. We would think of what economists call the natural rate of unemployment or normal rate of unemployment, long-run achievable rate of unemployment as roughly being in the 5% range. So the unemployment rate is very high. Still another indicator would be to look at the employment to the population ratio. And the employment to population ratio is now about 58%, and that's the lowest it's been since the early 1980s. So when we look at the employment statistics, whether we looked at employment as a share of the economy, or whether we looked at the unemployment rate, or whether we looked at the growth rate of real GDP, all of these would suggest that the economy is performing at a relatively poor level, if you like. And I don't know, it's kind of dangerous to get a college professor talking. He's likely to wind up and talk 50 minutes and talk about more segments. So maybe we might sort of break it up and think about, I've outlined a kind of an indication about where the economy is, and see if Larry or Bob want to add to anything that I've said or disagree with anything I've said.
I think the scariest question I would imagine for a person looking forward to graduating from college soon is this the new normal? I know there has been some debate about that, and whether this is part of the normal cycles of ups and downs, or a little bit longer cycle of down than usual, or is this going to be the new normal? Is it going to be increasingly difficult for college graduates, and especially for those without a college degree, to find employment?
Although I think it is important to note that I don't deny that that's an issue. I mean, that is something that we need to think about, because this unemployment rate has been high for a long time. Mm-hmm. But of course, and Dr. Gortney would know more about this than I do, but historically, a financial collapse or a recession caused by a financial collapse has been harder to recover from than just a collapse in the business cycle, than in something that would be the result. For example, compare this economic crisis to what happened between 1980-81 in the early years of the Reagan administration, when, in an effort to contain out of control inflation, which was in double digits by 1981, mm-hmm. the Federal Reserve imposed really high interest rates. And that had the effect of driving up unemployment by driving down financial transactions and loans. But then when they took the caps off and interest rates began to decline in late 82, by late 83, unemployment, which had reached over 10%, was coming down rapidly. So by the time President Reagan ran again in 84, it was under 8%. It was about 7.2, in fact. Mm-hmm. That's a kind of normal recession, business cycle recession. But a collapse of the financial sector of the kind that we had in 2008 would be comparable only to what occurred in the Depression. And according to some indicators, the financial sector was coming apart faster from 2008 to 2009 than it was between 1929 and 1933. And that the Federal Reserve and the government, in a largely bipartisan fashion, did a great job compared to what happened in the 30s in jumping in to prevent further collapse. And they did it through TARP, and they did it through initiatives by the Federal Reserve to loan money at very cheap rates in the trillions of dollars to the collapsing banks. And in my judgment, they also did it, at least on the part of the Obama administration, with a stimulus program that, according to most indicators, built back somewhere between 2 and 3 million jobs, and kept the unemployment rate from going higher than 9.3%. Remember, it had gone over 10% with Reagan. It had gone to 25% back in the Depression. So those measures together collectively prevented a repeat of the horrific Depression of the 30s, which, remember, lasted about 12 years until World War II funding so stimulated the economy. They had growth rates in the double figures, and we had an unemployment rate under 2% through World War II.
You can get that unemployment under 2% when you draft 12
that helps. People. Hey, they're employed. They're public employees.
Yeah, a lot of people envision.
So I think the point here is that in talking about the 7.8% unemployment that we have at this point, If you look at what happened in the Depression, that unemployment rate was at 24%. It got down to 15%. It went back to over 20% over a 9-year period through the New Deal and the Roosevelt administration. But in large measure, major initiatives by the public sector, whether the Federal Reserve, Congress, or the administration, played a major role both in getting us out of the Depression and also limiting the impact of the financial collapse of 2008. Furthermore, remember that college graduate unemployment rate is only about 4% right now.
Well, let me say that my interpretation or my view of what happened both during the Great Depression and what's happened during the current situation is almost the opposite of what Larry just outlined.
No!
I think the reason why the Great Depression was so long and so severe was the stupid things that were done in the political arena during that period, starting with the 50% increase in tariffs of the Smoot-Hawley bill of 1930.
I agree.
By the way, the stock market had virtually recovered from, you people were all taught about, hey, the Great Depression was caused by the stock market. Interestingly enough, how many of you knew that by April of 1930 that the stock market had recovered all the losses of October? And it was when the Smoot-Hawley trade bill was passed that the economy took another nosedive. Of course, Larry's absolutely right. The one part that he had mentioned earlier that certainly we would be in agreement on is monetary policy was very perverse during the 1930s and was a huge contributing factor. But then in 1932, that we had the largest tax increase in the history of the United States. Largest tax rate increase in the history of the United States. The top rate was increased from 25% in 1931 to 63% in 1932. Now that's a tax increase. The lowest rate was increased from 1.5% to 4%. So more than double during that particular period.
Under President Hoover.
Under President Hoover and with the Democratic Congress. I've often sort of said the Democratic Congress probably thought, man, this is an opportunity. We can throw the economy into an absolute disaster and for sure we'll win the 32 election. But that's another issue. But regardless of the sort of political considerations, again, that economists of most all persuasions would say that was a dumb policy in terms of the tax increase in 32. Then the New Deal comes in, and the New Deal, what's their policy? Hey, their agriculture policy was if we can just destroy enough stuff, we can get prosperity. So let's plow under 20% of the grain crops. Let's spray 20% of the potato crops so they're unfit for human consumption. Let's kill 6 million baby pigs. All those things were done under the Agriculture Adjustment Act in 1933, 1934. And in addition to that, you had the so-called National Industrial Recovery Act, which was basically assured that there wouldn't be a recovery, at least not in the industrial sector, which combined more than 500 industries into cartels and essentially allowed them to set everything from the working hours to the prices that would be imposed on all the firms in that given industry. Again, counterproductive kind of policy. And the tax increase in 32, I guess the Roosevelt administration didn't think the Hoover administration was dumb enough, so they increased the tax rate from 63% to 79% in 1936. All of these policies resulted in the Great Depression being longer and more severe than otherwise would have been the case. Now, that sort of takes us up to the current time period. And I don't want to, I think it's probably better if we talk in shorter segments, but a lot of things that we've done in the current time period have been very counterproductive. Certainly the Cash for Clunkers program, the idea, hey, destroy these cars and that's going to lead to prosperity. I don't think so. It led to higher prices for used cars. And I guess maybe we ought to pay teenagers to go out and bash windshields of cars, and if we could destroy enough of them, we could really increase demand. But I think the central issue here is going to be about the impact of particularly budget deficits. And this is an area where there is considerable division among economists. When Larry was in my class, how many of you believe Larry was in my class?
It was a great economics class. It was the best one I ever took. 1970. 42 years ago this month.
But in any case, in that time period, the dominant view in economics, now that was not a macro class, so we probably didn't deal too much with that, Larry, but the dominant view was certainly that what we called the Keynesian view, that budget deficits would stimulate aggregate demand and lead to an increase in output and employment, and so during a recession would be very positive kinds of policies, and of course that you'd follow the opposite kind of thing to restrain inflation. That became hotly debated particularly during the 70s, with regard to increased emphasis during the 70s on monetary policy and the role that monetary policy plays, but also the view that there are secondary effects of these expenditure policies, and in particular, the borrowing in order to finance the deficit is going to imply higher future taxes. And a part of a segment of the school of thought in economics says, hey, those higher future taxes, people are going to anticipate them, and that's going to be a drag on the economy, being an offset to the stimulus associated with the deficits. You would also expect that the higher borrowing would have impact upon interest rates, and if the borrowing was financed by foreigners, would lead to an appreciation of the U.S. currency, which would also exert a negative impact on output and employment. So that this issue of the real impact of fiscal policy and budget deficits and the debt is certainly both a major differences between the two candidates, but also a major difference among economists. And I expect that we'll probably probe more into that as we proceed.
I completely
Nick,
agree.
you may want to, I mean, Nick is hot off of the press in terms of his economics degree, so you may want to pitch in. After all, Candy Crowley pitches in, Nick, so why shouldn't our moderator?
That's true. Maybe I should be a little more like her. I don't know if everyone would agree with that.
If you do that, I'm gonna get in your face like Romney did.
We don't want that, so I'm not gonna pull one of those moves.
Shall I be the Biden here? I was going to say, a lot of you may have read about the Great Depression, or your grandparents may have told you about it, and you imagine hungry people, and maybe that was a sign of great shortages, but actually the opposite was true. There was a glut of goods and somewhat a glut of labor from thousands of sharecroppers and other people moving out of the farms, and what there was a shortage of was liquidity or money. According to many people, even the repeal of prohibition did not create enough liquidity. So,
if I could just jump in, though, I think we've got a great conversation, great groundwork. I think we have a little bit of idea of what the different economic philosophies are, what are the costs and benefits. Yeah. But I'd really like to start applying that knowledge. I think we're getting into it in today's situation. How can we take our understanding of those historical events and how the economy works and the different philosophies on the policy, and use that information to judge the candidates of today. But I very much appreciate that discussion. So to start getting into President Obama and Governor Romney's policies a little more specifically, we've got a video from the president's campaign, and we're going to also do one for Governor Romney. But just to start it off, get an idea of what they're talking about, what their perspectives are on the debt and the deficit and fiscal policy and all the things that we've been talking about. So we'll start off with President Obama, talk a little bit about that, get a video of Governor Romney, and then we'll come back and compare.
During the last weeks of this campaign, there will be debates, speeches, and more ads. But if I could sit down with you in your living room or around the kitchen table, here's what I'd say. When I took office, we were losing nearly 800,000 jobs a month, and we're mired in a rut. Today, I believe that as a nation, we are moving forward again. But we have much more to do to get folks back to work and make the middle class secure again. Now, Governor Romney believes that with even bigger tax cuts for the wealthy and fewer regulations on Wall Street, all of us will prosper. In other words, he doubled down on the same trickle-down policies that led to the crisis in the first place. So what's my plan? First, we create 1 million new manufacturing jobs and help businesses double their exports, give tax breaks to companies that invest in America, not that ship jobs overseas. Second, we cut our oil imports in half and produce more American-made energy. Oil, clean coal, natural gas, and new resources like wind, solar, and biofuels, all while doubling the fuel efficiency of cars and trucks. Third, we ensure that we maintain the best workforce in the world by preparing 100,000 additional math and science teachers, training 2 million Americans with the job skills they need at our community colleges, cutting the growth of tuition in half, and expanding student aid so more Americans can afford it. Fourth, a balanced plan to reduce our deficit by $4 trillion over the next decade. On top of the trillion in spending we've already cut, I'd ask the wealthy to pay a little more. And as we end the war in Afghanistan, let's apply half the savings to pay down our debt and use the rest for some nation building right here at home. It's time for a new economic patriotism, rooted in the belief that growing our economy begins with a strong, thriving middle class. Read my plan, compare it to Governor Romney's, and decide for yourself. Thanks for listening. I'm Barack Obama, and I approve this message.
We've got a little taste of what the president's economic policies may be. Talked about a lot of different subjects there, and I think you heard some of the key words that we've been talking about. You referenced the debt and deficits, talking about spending. So let's try and tie all those ideas together. Dr. Polifka, I'd be interested to get your perspective first. We talked about one of the goals here that President Obama said was, he wants to create 1 million new jobs, he wants to train teachers, and do a few other things. So clearly giving us an idea of what the fiscal policies would be, how government's spending its money. And he also said that we want to cut the deficit and the debt. So can you just briefly describe to us, how do we reconcile those things? Would he be able to achieve those goals? What would the outlook be for the federal government's fiscal and policies under President Obama, based on that video?
Well, I don't think either of the candidates have been specific and detailed enough in what they propose to do. But leaning as much as possible from what the president said, and also based on an assessment of what he's done, what his policies have been or his recommendations have been for the last 3.5 years, I think that what he's proposing to do is to both pursue what might be considered an investment strategy that's designed to increase the growth rate. And Jim mentioned earlier that historically the growth rate's been over 3%. It's been trending down, actually, over the last 30, 40 years, under 3%. And for the last several years, since the Great Recession began, it's been under 2% most years. So if we're going to do anything in reducing the unemployment rate and creating greater economic opportunity for young people and others, we're going to have to get that growth rate back up towards 3%. And I think what he's proposing to do is pursue policies that will do that. Probably, if I were him, I would actually make a greater effort to tie that into what was achieved, in my judgment, with the stimulus, 2009 through 2011. That was a $786 billion program, included about 38% of it in tax cuts. But it represented the kinds of investments that were responsible for generating about 2.5 million jobs and keeping the unemployment rate from going over 10%.
Well, he has proposed. It did go over 10%.
No, it didn't. It went up to.
Check your facts. 10.1 was the top.
Was it 10.1? The Reagan was what? 10.3?
No, 10.8.
Oh.
So the Reagan recession was more severe.
Shorter term.
Well, of course it was shorter term because they adopted sensible policies rather than.
No, well, what they adopted was a monetary policy that squeezed credit.
And remember, he inherited Jimmy Carter's mess.
8%.
Well, the inflation rate was high. But let's let Larry proceed because I don't want to be like Joe Biden here. So.
Or Mitch. What he's proposing with the jobs bill that he introduced last fall, which is a kind of a follow-up to the stimulus bill of 2009, is to continue to make investments in innovations in the economy, including especially green energy investments. And although there's been a lot of attention paid to Solyndra, I think it's important to note that actually investments in green technology have increased several-fold over the last 3 years, and most of it's come from private investments following federal investments in new programs, because private investors see the potential here for the growth of a major new industry if you look 10, 20 years down the road. And he's also talking about restoring some of those positions that were cut in education at the state level. teachers. It wants to restore about 250 or so thousand of those. They kept 300,000 teachers from being fired with the original stimulus bill. That is sort of an effort to stimulate growth, while at the same time he has also talked about containing the debt or the deficits mainly through selective cuts in federal expenditures. Not at the level that has been recommended by the Republicans in Congress or Governor Romney, but at a substantial level. His thinking is that you don't want to cut so much that you stall out the economy, that you push on the brake at the same time that you're trying to push on the gas with a stimulus. So you've got to balance this in some kind of proportional fashion, with the emphasis short term on stimulus, with the emphasis longer term on a contained deficit. And remember that one of the best ways to contain the deficit year to year is to get increased growth. With increased growth comes increased revenue, comes increased taxes, and a reduction in the deficit.
So Bob, I'd like to get your thoughts on if we're looking at the president's policies as a kind of investment strategy that the federal government's making in the country, saying, if we spend some money in these particular ways, it's going to pay off because you're going to see economic growth, and then that will lead to the debt and deficits going down. What do you think about that? Is that a strategy that's going to work, or is the investment going to pay off more, or is it going to cost us more in the end?
It somewhat depends on what you're investing in. It always amazes me that when this country was much poorer, it was able to build an interstate highway system that has facilitated the growth of commerce in this country. Now I don't think we can even afford to maintain it because we're spending so much on people's personal health. But be that as it may, it depends on what you're investing in. But President Obama's commercial here was more a series of talking points designed to appeal to particular groups, including students. We're going to give you free stuff. And sooner or later, as Margaret Thatcher pointed out, you run out of other people's money. And you students will be inheriting the enormous debts run up during this period. So I think essentially at heart, President Obama is a redistributionist whose main goal is to take money from those who have earned it and give it to those who are cronies of his administration.
And Dr. Gwartney, as Bob pointed out, if the president's kind of appeal to audiences such as the student group is, hey, we're going to spend lots of money on you, as students looking at how to decide on a candidate, should they say, that sounds great, I have bills to pay, I want to get through college? Should they say, okay, that's the best economic policies to go with, or are there other things that they should be considering as well? Should they take the money, or is there something else that they should be evaluating too?
Well, let me just say this. I think, particularly as many of you are first-time voters, that it's very important that you evaluate candidates not on the basis of what they say they're wanting to do. That in the clip that we looked at, the president said that my plan is to create 1 million jobs. Well, how's he going to do it? What's the strategy? My plan is to improve the quality of education, hiring 300 additional teachers. Is hiring 300,000 additional teachers, is that going to improve the quality of education? Ask yourselves whether the policies that these guys are talking about, we haven't seen the Romney clip, I wouldn't be surprised we'll see much the same kind of thing, that essentially, here's what I'm going to do, outline a number of really good things that we all agree with. But as voters, we need to be analyzing whether or not what they're saying makes any sense. I oftentimes ask my students, I said, do you evaluate candidates on the basis of outcomes or intentions? And they'll narrowly always say, of course, outcomes. But essentially, the politicians apparently think we evaluate them on the basis of good intentions. If they've got good intentions, then we'll say, okay, well, that must be a really great thing. I just want to add one footnote to what Bob said about the productive projects. And because there's a major difference here between the way the private sector or market sector works and the way the political sector works with regard to that. Productive projects is one where you take the resources and utilize the resources to produce something that's more highly valued than the resources. Now, private firms have an incentive to consistently do that. That's the road to profits. If you're going to have net revenue, if you're going to achieve profits, you have to be able to produce a product that or a good or a service that you're able to sell for more than what the cost you incurred by purchasing the services of the resources. So there's this, and losses, of course, indicate that you reduce the value of the resources. So we want to bring those kinds of things to a halt. There's a strong incentive to do that in the private sector. There's nothing at all parallel in the political sector to that incentive structure. And that's why so much of the political expenditures is driven by special interest politics, as Bob talked about. It's really about taking funds from or imposing in some kind of policy that is going to favor certain well-organized interests at the expense of disorganized groups such as consumers and taxpayers, and then soliciting campaign contributions from the groups that you provide the favors to, and then use the campaign contributions to finance these silly commercials that we've been looking at. That's what the political process is about. So think about how that process works before you say, hey, man, we want to elevate and have more of this kind of stuff.
A really good example of that is the financial sector.
Yes, yes, thank you.
Absolutely.
The difference between the Republicans and Democrats is a different group of interest groups that they fleece the same taxpayers and consumers, but support a different set of interest groups.
But the financial fleecing was of a magnitude that I think far excels anything that might have occurred in terms of food stamp recipients or something like that. And a lot of that occurred just in the way that Dr. Gore did describe. Deregulation led to the kinds of practices that we have become accustomed to in terms of securitization and credit default swaps and really the buildup, the massive buildup of what's called toxic assets. Then they blow up and collapse. And then what happens? They get bailed out because they're too big to fail. And one of the reasons they became too big to fail is because of deregulation that they used their profits when they were making them to make sure that they achieved through Congress so that they could increasingly concentrate financial wealth in a handful of banks. And incidentally, they're more concentrated today than they were before the financial collapse began in 2007, 2008. 5 financial organizations now control about 60% of all financial assets. It was 12 who controlled 60% in 2007. And that's a concern that I have as it relates to both candidates. I agree in this case with George Will, who's often considered the leading conservative columnist the last 20 years, who said in his last column, it is time to break them up. This is too great a threat. This is a moral hazard to the max. It's time to end them.
And if you want to see where all this crony capitalism leads, go see Atlas Shrugged Part 2, which is playing at both theaters in Tallahassee.
Excellent. And so I think we've got here a couple different perspectives on the Obama video we saw. He was talking about his fiscal policies and things of that nature. And I think in terms of making a decision, we've heard you, are we talking about an investment that's going to pay off in terms of economic growth and lowering the unemployment rate? Or is it a kind of crony capitalism that's a handout to particular groups that taxpayers are paying for that's just going to add to the debt? So I think a couple different perspectives there. Now why don't we take a look at the Romney video and then we can compare and contrast.
Good evening from the Magnus Arena at the University of Denver in Denver, Colorado. And I welcome you to the first of the 2012 presidential debates.
And what we're seeing right now is, in my view, a trickle-down government approach, which has government thinking it can do a better job than free people pursuing their dreams, and it's not working. And the proof of that is 23 million people out of work. The proof of that is 1 out of 6 people in poverty. The proof of that is we've gone from 32 million on food stamps to 47 million on food stamps. The proof of that is that 50% of college graduates this year can't find work. We know that the path we're taking is not working. It's time for a new path. I know this is bigger than an election about the two of us as individuals. It's bigger than our respective parties. It's an election about the course of America. What kind of America do you want to have for yourself and for your children? There's no question in my mind that if the president were to be reelected, you'll continue to see a middle-class squeeze with incomes going down and prices going up. I'll get incomes up again. You'll see chronic unemployment. We've had 43 straight months with unemployment above 8%. If I'm president, I will help create 12 million new jobs in this country with rising incomes. The president's reelected, you'll see dramatic cuts to our military. I will not cut our commitment to our military. I will keep America strong and get America's middle class working again.
Okay, so another interesting video from one of the campaigns, perhaps lacking a bit in specifics, which is something I think was a criticism that arose of the Obama video.
Well, he's already created hundreds of jobs among fact checkers.
That's true. But Bob, maybe we can start with you to get your views. I think maybe the crux of that video, Romney's case, is under President Obama, the economy is not doing so well. We see high unemployment, low incomes, elect me as president, and my policies are going to change that. We talked about the historical trends with the economy. I think there was a general characterization that maybe it's not doing as well as it should be, but is it fair to say that we're on a negative economic path with President Obama and Romney is going to put us on a positive track?
I think it's fair to say we've been on a negative economic path under President Obama, and his constant tendency to blame it on the previous administration is not entirely accurate, because some of the roots of the deregulation that Dr. Polifka talked about go back to the 90s during the Clinton administration, the Community Reinvestment Act that encouraged lending to people who weren't creditworthy to buy homes and artificially keeping the rates low and reducing the reserve requirement for banks. But that's history, but I think you can't blame the continuation of the negative trend totally on the president's predecessors. In addition, his remedies, like those that were tried in the Great Depression, have somewhat been counterproductive, I think. A lot of it has been wasted spending that has left us more in debt and with a larger debt service to spend. So, but I got to say, you're right, there was very little specificity in Governor Romney's commercial. I think candidates tend to paint in broad brushstrokes, and so it's a matter about direction, whether the president would depend on private sector to get us out of the mess or on government, and to what degree. We're not electing an emperor. The amount of discretion a president has over the economy is very constrained. It depends a lot on what Congress does. It depends on what the Federal Reserve does. It also depends on developments in Europe and Asia. The Chinese economy is cooling a little bit. So there are a lot of aspects of it that are out of control of any president, whether it be Governor Romney or President Obama. So the basic question is, do you want more government, more redistribution under President Obama, or do you want to try to revive the private sector?
And, Dr. Gortney, if that's in your view, if that's the kind of central trade-off we're facing, what are the kind of costs and benefits that come with each approach? How would someone look at that and say, well, if these are the two paths, which is the one that I think we should go down?
Well, I guess I would preface my remarks by saying, to a degree, I dealt with the general issue when I talked about when the market sector, you have this incentive to engage in profitable activity, which, when property rights are well defined, essentially means that you're engaging in productive kinds of activities rather than unproductive ones, whereas the political sector doesn't have anything similar to that. With regard to sort of where these alternative kind of paths lead, I think, well, in general, and I must say I think we could be more confident about the president's policies because we have 4 years to sort of observe what he's done. That you can be confident that you're going to continue to have the budget deficit Keynesian prescription that, as I indicated, is highly debatable with regard to its effectiveness. You can continue to be assured that there's going to be a growth of government. Government will tend to expand under President Obama. I'm somewhat less confident about what the direction would be under Governor Romney. I mean, he certainly paints the picture of his vision as different than that of the president. He has less confidence in government. He intends to shrink government. But I've been around long enough to know that what politicians say is not always what they do. And so I think that there would be reason to question. But with regard to the general strategy, the experience of Japan during the 1990s and Canada during the beginning in the 1998 or so for the next decade provide us evidence about where these two prescriptions lead. The Japanese faced a similar kind of financial crisis, and they responded in essentially the same way, I guess we should say, we've responded in the same way that they responded in the early 1990s. That is to say, running very large budget deficits, increasing the size of government. Government in Japan grew from roughly 30% to almost 40% as a share of the economy. Their debt went from a trivial amount to almost 100% of GDP in a decade. And we refer to that 1990s in Japan as the lost decade. Now, Canada, facing a similar problem in the late 1990s, where they had a high level of debt, their credit rating had been downgraded, and that they had government expenditures were 53% of GDP, and that essentially they faced a very difficult situation and somewhat similar to what we do. High debt, slow growing economy, and a high rate of unemployment. What Canada did is reduce its government expenditures. They cut government expenditures in a 3-year period from 53% of GDP to 43% of GDP. And that they moved the budget toward a balance. And by 1998, and for the decade, a full decade afterwards, they ran a surplus every year. And what was the results in Canada? The results in Canada is that Canada had the fastest growing economy among the G7 countries during that particular period. So essentially the Canadian experience suggests that the theory I outlined, that market approaches are going to be superior to larger government and more central planning, is in fact the recipe that works. So I encourage you, by the way, those of you who, some of you may be taking an economics class where you have our textbook, all this is outlined in the special topics in our macroeconomics text. So if you want more detail, you can get it there.
So we got a nice little plug there for
the
economics department. Got to do that.
You might check out this book too, Common Sense Economics by Dr. James Gordon.
But it didn't have all that detail.
So we've got some discussion here on the fiscal policy.
Can we respond to that? If you look, let me draw some other comparisons. I think that what Dr. Gordon was talking about in Canada could also be applied in the United States between about 93 and 2000 with the Clinton administration, which also generated substantial surpluses.
And reduced government expenditures. It shifted towards surplus. Just exactly, I agree.
That's right. But it was not an austerity approach. It was based on containing, on increased revenues that led to increased, really a surplus in the last 3 years of that administration that carried over to 2001. Then with the Bush administration, what you had were the tax cuts, and you had the unfunded initiatives, especially in the defense and security areas, and also continuing deregulation that did begin in the Clinton administration with the elimination of Glass-Steagall. All of that led to the financial collapse and the Great Recession that occurred in the last year, began to unfold in the last year of the Bush administration. And as the President Obama pointed out, by the time he came to office, we were bleeding 700,000 to 800,000 jobs a month, lost jobs. If you look at what's happened in Europe over the last 2 or 3 years, they have decided to deal with their debt crisis across Southern Europe with what's called an austerity program. That is, cuts in the budget and increases in the taxes in order to restore balance to their their expenditures and debts. What has it led to? It's led to increasing unemployment, increasing growth in their deficits, and in the case of Britain, which has undertaken a really aggressive austerity program under the Tories, they have descended into a second recession, a double-dip recession over the last 8 months. They've got a minus growth rate. So, you know, I think it's important to kind of take into consideration historical factors and also differences among countries. These vary considerably. And I'm not at all convinced that one single approach always works everywhere under all historical circumstances. In some cases, I think a stimulative Keynesian approach is effective. I think in other cases, you need to make cutbacks. You need to pursue austerity. And I really have been impressed by the historical kind of perspective we've taken here today. Because a lot of people in economics don't think that history is all that important. But in fact, there's enormous that you can learn from it. And one thing you can certainly learn is the complexity of these issues and the need to kind of take each economic experience as, you know, something that doesn't fit necessarily in one playbook, in one ideological framework, but is something that you have to look at from multiple perspectives to come up with workable solutions.
One lesson they learned in Europe was the longer you wait to address the problem, the more painful the medicine may be. And if you look at this case of Greece, for example, where the indebtedness got way beyond the size of the economy, it's kind of analogous to who can rescue Greece? Well, maybe Europe can rescue Greece, but that's like asking a buff lifeguard to rescue a drowning child. If the United States economy tanks to the same degree because indebtedness is far exceeding the size of the economy, who's around to rescue us? That would be like asking a small child to rescue a beached whale.
Let me suggest something that we need to get to if we have time. It is the healthcare issue. The driving, and I think Dr. Gordon mentioned this, the thing that's driving this deficit is health care in the United States. It's not true across the world.
Programs generally.
Well, and I think that's I think a good point, but I do want to get into
the answer is
no. All right, so a passionate or a refusal of the point Dr. Courtney made there. But we do want to get some questions from the audience to delve into some of the specifics that are important to you. I think the panelists have given us a great idea of the historical perspective we need to take into account. They'd give us a general idea of the different paths that the candidates would take us on, given us a good framework to evaluate that. But what are some of the specifics that you all are interested in?
So both candidates hinted towards some conceived idea of energy independence, and I recognize that alternative fuels part of that, but oil is part of that. I think I've been confusing. Like, we're not going to raise tariffs. Like, oil is going to constantly be a global market from now on to me. So can somebody speak to, is that even possible getting energy independence, or are we always going to have to buy and sell oil from foreign countries? I know you're not energy experts.
Okay. You want to put up tariffs around our oil production?
No, I think he said that wasn't feasible, is what.
Right. Maybe it is.
Well, I'll take a crack at that. I mean, obviously, there's several dimensions to the issue of energy. And I do think low-cost energy is important, and it can be an important driving force for economic growth, which certainly all of us agree would be a positive element. I am quite skeptical with regard to the sort of subsidies that we've granted, and particularly the scale that we've granted them to wind and solar. That Larry mentioned that, well, a lot of private investors are now seeing that these are good investments in the long run. Well, if they are, they don't have to be subsidized then. That essentially we have invested roughly about $90 billion into wind and solar energy, which is 2 to 4 times more expensive in terms of its cost of generating electricity than natural gas and petroleum. So in essence, we're subsidizing the high-cost method of producing electricity. And the result is going to be higher energy costs, higher electric costs. And that a number of European countries have actually, Spain, for example, has gone that same kind of route, where they essentially attempted to subsidize these. And that therefore, I think when we look at the more general picture, there is a real positive element here, though. And that is that the natural gas discoveries in particular, and of course most of you know that natural gas is a very clean burning fuel, that the discoveries in the last 5 years or so have such that we've gone from 10 years in terms of our energy relative to our consumption level, proven reserves, to 100 years. And that's a low-cost method. And that if we simply allow market forces to work, that's going to be our best shot at getting both low-cost energy and largely energy independence.
And we have an example right here in Florida of misguided government subsidies. I was able to have a dialogue with the Agriculture Commissioner, another member of the state cabinet the other day. A gun shop owner in Tampa named William Vasden scammed people and was indicted in federal court 3 weeks ago for scamming people out of millions of dollars, including the federal government and almost the state government, which managed to stop it because auditors looked at it. But he was going to raise a shrub called kanaf and another one called camelina as biofuels.
Did you say cannabis?
With the idea,
that's the other guys.
with the idea to export it to wood pellets to Europe as a biofuel, and the state was about ready to send $500,000 his way, and when somebody blew the whistle. But there's a lot of that picking losers in the energy sector.
I think that's a good
But
example.
let me add on to what Dr. Bortner was saying, and the question. I mean, we haven't talked about it, and of course neither of the candidates. It's one of those missed issues that you talked about that we may get to. But climate change, it's almost as if, we solved that problem, right? Somehow it went away. But as the evidence, as I read it, and I'm sure you do too, continues to accumulate that it is in fact a serious challenge. And if anything, we need to get to it sooner rather than later. But it's something that has been neglected, and it's very much related to energy issues, and especially when it comes to renewable fuels. So I think that we need to continue to invest in wind and solar and other renewable fuels. And if it means that we're investing at 2 or 3 times what the actual benefit is, I think that given the potential impact 20 years down the road in terms of reducing carbon, it's worth it.
That's what you said about ethanol 5 years ago.
No, I never said about ethanol. I hate ethanol.
And now essentially,
I hated ethanol.
even the environmentalists have figured out that ethanol is actually counterproductive.
And I can't even get a piece of corn now.
At least not at a reasonable price.
Yeah, okay. So I'm just going to be really honest, and I know you kind of touched on this, but I've kind of been like checking in and out here with my understanding. So in reference to the 2 candidates, you referenced that the debates and everything, they're kind of ambiguous on their actual plan. Not necessarily not having a plan, but how they're actually going to enact those plans and what they want to do. We've heard, we want to do this, we want to subsidize this, we, want to lower taxes here, whatever the case may be. But we haven't actually heard through the debates how they plan to do that, to make all of these things work for their bigger plan. So, as the average voter, someone who's not really an economist, what would you suggest us do to narrow between these 2 candidates? What should we kind of pick out in their conversation to say, okay, this would be best for our country? Do we need to rely just on history like you've been discussing, or should we continue to look to the future and say, well, maybe we should give this candidate a shot since we haven't really seen how he would perform yet? Does that make sense to everyone?
I just add that I'd ask for the elevator speech on that.
Right. Just
put this down.
Layman's terms, just as basic as you can get it.
All right, maybe if we've got different perspectives here, I think, on some of the issues. What if each of you have 30 seconds, just 30. I'll try and be a good moderator and keep you on time, but if you've got 30 seconds, we'll go 1, 2, 3, starting here on my left.
Why don't you start that
okay,
and I can comment on the dumb things they say.
All right, civil discourse. So we've got 30 seconds on the clock.
I don't mean to be a downer on this question, but the fact is that there is some level of complexity to these issues, and they need to be addressed fairly and in a way that really can truly inform rather than sound bites. But I have one suggestion. How is Governor Romney going to pay for his tax cut?
Economic growth.
$8 trillion tax cut, okay? And he has identified limiting deductions to $25,000. That will cover $780 billion of an $8 trillion tax cut over 10 years. That gap is large, shall we say? That is a real serious, I think, challenge for Governor Romney.
Well, let me say, I would be happy, and I'll give Larry the answer to his question after the time, but I'm not going to use my 30 seconds to give the answer.
See, it's complicated.
I think the sort of short answer to what you should consider is if in fact you have a lot of confidence in the political process and you think that larger government and the politicians are going to be good at allocating things and they're saintly in terms of their decision-making process, that then you should support the president. I think if you think that the alternative approach, and as I indicated, I'm a skeptic with regard to whether Romney really is going to reduce the size of government and rely more upon markets, but at least there would be some probability that he would do that. So if that's what you want, you should support Governor Romney.
All right, now you've got to listen to there too. Are you ready to pick
Well,
them apart?
well said. I think this election is about who's going to take over the helm of the Queen Elizabeth as it's chugging along in an iceberg-strewn ocean, and it's very difficult to turn that around. And so it's a matter of degree. I think Governor Romney might slow the growth of government. Remember, back during the Reagan administration, if the Congress wanted to increase something 10% and Reagan wanted to increase 5%, that was deemed a 50% cut in programs. So, but I think slowing the growth of government in relation to the size of the economy would be a beneficial thing. It would leave more money in people's pockets to revive the economy, and that's the best kind of stimulus.
All right, any other questions? If we do have some time, I know we're running about an hour and 10 minutes right now. I would like to circle back on the point you raised about taxes, but I know you've had your hand up.
This is about monetary policy and the recent establishment of QE3. And until now, the Federal Reserve has bought government debt to finance the stimulus, and this time they're buying mortgage-backed securities and open-ended policy. Is this going to, do you think that this stimulus spending is going to be truly beneficial, or do you think that this is an attempt to artificially prop up the real estate and finance, or the real estate and housing sector of the economy, which wasn't so successful a few years ago?
So and whoever would like to take this question, if you wouldn't mind just kind of prefacing, we had a kind of detailed question there about monetary policy. Recently, the Federal Reserve in September said that they're going to start a new monetary policy initiative. If you wouldn't mind just giving maybe a little context for the people who aren't as familiar with that, and then getting into your answer.
Yeah, let me comment on that particular view. The Fed, the one thing that it can really affect over an extended period of time is the general level of prices. And if you have rapid monetary expansion, if you have expansionary monetary policy, it'll tend to lead to rising prices and inflation. If you have contractionary monetary policy, it'll tend to lead to deflation, generally lead, at least in the short run, as you make that switch, lead to a recessionary type of economy. But the economy, the Fed cannot control the growth rate in the long run. All it can do is establish an environment for economic growth. And the best thing it can do is focus on long-run price stability. And that's where the Fed ought to be focusing. I am deeply disturbed that the Fed has become so involved in various kinds of programs that mean that it's playing favorites among different financial institutions. And whereas previously it controlled the money supply simply by buying and selling treasury bonds, now it's buying and selling a much wider set of things, including mortgage-backed securities, of which we don't know what the underlying value of those mortgage-backed securities are, and all that sort of thing. So I'm disturbed by that path of the Fed, and I'm also disturbed by the fact that the Fed, the chairman, tends to act as if he can manipulate the economy, add stimulus here and lead to more rapid growth. Maybe if the inflation then becomes a problem, that he can pull the lever. That my hero with regard to monetary policy, Milton Friedman, who, by the way, Chairman Bernanke often talks about how that he thinks Friedman would approve of the path the Fed has taken. I'm sure he would approve of the fact they didn't follow the kind of policies the Fed did during the 30s.
Kept interest rates low.
But on the other hand, that Milton Friedman said these lags are long and variable. And when the Fed follows this stop-go policy, it's going to lead to more instability rather than stability. And that's where I fear that we're headed.
So I'm going to just insert, on that same vein though, there's a question of whether the Federal Reserve, which helps lead monetary policy, should they be expanding monetary policy, injecting more dollars in the economy or not? And I think we got a little bit of your view on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I would kind of follow up to that, and depending on who's elected, how much influence do they have over it? You mentioned Chairman Bernanke, who heads up the Fed. Should the audience here today say, well, if I don't like expansionary monetary policy, I should vote for this candidate or the other? What can the audience expect will change depending on who's elected?
The other side of this, though, from the Fed perspective, is that they are trying to keep interest rates as low as possible. And that, in large measure, is our housing policy now. And you know, at the root of this collapse, besides what happened on Wall Street, and of course what happened on Wall Street is very much related to what happened in housing with the subprime mortgage issue. And one of the thoughts is that until we can fix housing, until we can get it on a stable glide path back to somewhere where it was for 60 years after the Depression, we're not really going to escape this recession. And I think that what the feds are trying to do is put enough money out into the economy to keep the interest rates low so that mortgage rates stay within the range of 3.5% to 4.5%. And that eventually, over a period of time, the mortgage market will gradually recover, the housing market will gradually come back, and it is an enormous part of the economy. And I think that's in the absence of congressional action, expansionary action, that's what the feds feel they have to do to fill the gap.
So maybe we have time for one more question.
Healthcare.
It's a
Healthcare
small
is
little
huge.
question, I'm sure it would.
Well, they had a
Healthcare is
second to
80%
sum up.
of the deficit for the next 50 years. That's all it is.
They had a session on healthcare.
Did they get to that?
Yes, they had a
Yeah, they did
session.
have a program on healthcare.
Yeah,
So they're not completely lost on that one.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
an important point nonetheless. Do we have any other questions, or can we just get a kind of closing statement from the panelists who might want to reiterate some of those points?
I guess I'm concerned about healthcare retirement. Just what is the opposition or reason for not maybe raising the retirement and Social Security age? I've heard arguments about that.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry we don't have enough time to really get into that because it's something I've been looking at for some time, and it's what I call the retirement security crisis. Social Security right now is 4.8% of the GDP. It's going to about 6 to 6.2% over the next 40 years. That's not very much. That's about 0.3% of the GDP, even with the doubling of the population over 65, of the Social Security beneficiary population. Social Security is, in my judgment, the finest retirement security program that we have. As a matter of fact, with the erosion of private pensions over the last 30 years, as we've moved from defined benefits to 401s and such, Social Security has loomed larger and larger as the major pillar in our retirement security system. We should be doing everything we can to strengthen it, not cut it back. Now, you've heard different strategies for cutting it, including increasing the retirement age. The problem with that is about half the population of this country has experienced no increase in longevity over the last 40 years. As a matter of fact, a substantial percentage have experienced decreasing longevity over the last 20 years, including white women with less than a high school graduate education. They have lost 4 years in average longevity since 1992. And if you increase the retirement age to 69 or 70, these are people who are really going to be afflicted by such a policy. And we already have a problem in terms of people who blue-collar workers or who otherwise have to make maximum use of their bodies over a 40-year period, essentially wearing out in their late 50s and early 60s. That's why they go on early retirement to such an extent. Over 50% of the population retires at 62. That's in large measure because they find such difficulty in continuing employment, even though they get reduced benefits by 25% by retiring early. I think that is an unnecessary and really burdensome policy to expand, to increase the retirement age, especially on people who can handle it, who are going to have the hardest time with it. I mean, people like us, we can work until we're as old as Dr. Gordy and me.
No, you won't be able to.
I mean, they're going to have to drag us out of here, okay? But for somebody who, you know, is doing manual labor, who's doing construction work, somebody who stands on his or her feet 8 to 10 hours a day, it's an altogether different experience. It's another world. They've also talked about decreasing the COLAs by going with the chain CPI, Consumer Price Index. That's a loser because already Social Security is going from 40% of replacing the last wage to 28% because of increasing health care costs. And now we're talking about reducing that even further. That is also a foolish policy in my judgment, and it has bipartisan support, including the president. It's a mistake.
So I think clearly we need some more time to talk about health care and the impact on the economy.
Can I make one comment on it?
We making closing statements
We're going to do a little closing statement. I'll give you some time then. Unfortunately, we are a bit out of time. As I think the panelists pointed out, when we're talking about the economy, it is a very complex subject. And we could take any piece of today's conversation and spend a couple hours on that. So And I'll let you all give maybe just a quick minute to give a closing statement, but I'd also like for you to maybe point out a resource to the audience where they can leave today and delve into these issues further and find a place to get non-biased factual information. So where would we like to start? Do we want to start here, Bob?
Well, I'll just say that if you are not depressed enough already, there's one thing that might be waiting in the wings for you at some point that would be beyond the control of the Fed, Congress, or the President, and that would be the possibility of hyperinflation. It's something that has been experienced in some countries. It's the way debtors usually prefer to work their way out of debt. They borrow money, they borrow good dollars and pay them back in cheap dollars. And there is a tremendous impetus in that direction. And I'm not saying that will happen. I'm just saying it's a possibility. And there's nothing more destabilizing to societies than hyperinflation, as has been shown in places like Weimar Republic of Germany, more recently in Zimbabwe, and sometimes in little spasms in Argentina and Brazil.
Deflation is pretty tough too.
Yeah, I'd just like to take my time building a little bit on what Larry's related to his latest comments, and that is to make the point that I don't know that we've sufficiently got across, that we really do face a difficult debt problem, and counting into debt the unfunded liabilities of Social Security, and as Larry has mentioned, at least to me privately, more importantly, Medicare. That we really need to have and demand that our political leaders, regardless of which one of them is elected and others in office, that they seriously take steps to get these entitlement programs and unfunded liabilities and this debt situation under control. And if we don't do it, then we're going to end up in something like Greece. I mean, we really are. Greece's debt as a share of GDP is roughly 150%. Now, they don't have a central bank. They're part of the Euro system, so we have a central bank, so we have that part. But we're now over 100%. And it's quite likely, when you move over 80%, that's kind of perceived of as a tipping point, if you like, where it's likely to lead to trouble if you move beyond that. So my call would be for all of us as citizens to demand that our political leaders, and I think the political leaders certainly of the last several years, not just the 4 years of the Obama administration, but even prior to that. This is not rocket science in the sense of something that nobody could anticipate, that Medicare and Social Security expenditures and other related senior citizen programs were going to rise sharply in the years ahead, but yet our political leaders took no steps to solve it. We need to demand that they do so.
2 points. One, summing up some of the previous discussion we've had here, I think a balanced approach to trying to contain the debt and at the same time stimulate the economy to restore higher growth and reduce unemployment is the kind of policy approach that we really need to have. Tax cuts alone will not stimulate the economy. There's no real evidence that leads to increased job growth. But at the same time, you do need to make sure that you're covering some portion of your debt. You don't have to get it down to zero, but you need to get it less than 100%. You need to be headed somewhere below 80%, as Dr. Courtney pointed out. But I don't think you can do that without also stimulating the economy so that through growth you get revenues to help reduce the deficits.
You got to have growth too, yeah.
But in terms of the last issue, the 75–80% of the deficits projected over the next 40 years comes from health care in the budget. That's Medicare, Medicaid, and veterans programs. And that is a function of the overall cost increases in the health care system generally, public and private. And just yesterday or day before, Kaiser came out with a report that showed that between 1996 and 2010, the Medicare program operated far more efficiently in terms of cost increases than the private insurance markets in this country. That if Medicare had been increasing at the same rate as private insurance over that 15-year period, Medicare would cost 37% more than it does today. And that's with a program that cares for people who have higher health care costs than the other part of the population, the 65 plus population. I think at some point we're going to have to come to grips with the fact that we're going to have to intervene in the healthcare economy in the way that every other developed country has for the last 40, 50 years to contain cost. If our costs increase if we spent the same percentage of our budget or of our GDP as the average of the 28 developed countries, we would actually be looking at surpluses in our federal budget over the next 30 years. That's how big a problem this is. And no country has been able to contain this without a global budget, without containing the overall cost of your healthcare system, and then negotiating how much providers are going to get, insurance companies are going to get, pharmaceuticals are going to get. There is essentially no effective market strategy that has ever appeared in history when it comes to healthcare cost containment.
All right, so 3 additional opinions, a good framework for us to consider when evaluating the candidates. So thank you again before it just comes up to all the panelists for a great discussion.